Okay, well, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, to Signal Through the Noise, Reaching Students of Generation Z. This is Kirk Daulerio, and I am one of the panelists for today's discussion. And I'm going to do some introductions before we get going. We're joined today by Joel Lee from Winston-Salem State University and also Ryan Hogan from Valdosta State University. Before I turn it over for introductions, I just had a couple of quick notes on logistics. First of all, we'd love for you to introduce yourselves on the chat button. So if you actually click on chat, we'd love to hear who you are, where you're from, what you're working on. And when you click on that chat, you'll notice that the default says all panelists. But if you click on that button, you could send it to all panelists and attendees. And this will also be a place for you to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll have some time at the end to address questions, but there might be some questions that come up in the midst of the presentation, and so I'll be monitoring those as well. And hopefully we can get to as many as we can. If not, we can definitely track those questions and be able to hopefully follow up and answer them after the presentation. But thank you so much for taking some time to join today on this beautiful early summer day here in New England. I'm not sure how it is in the rest of the country. But I thought before we got into the agenda, I always really find it interesting just to learn a little bit more about the panelists, who you are, where you're from, what got you to where you are today. And just from my own personal standpoint, I've spent over this is year 24 in and around higher ed. So I was I was a first generation college student. I was a Pell Grant kid, and my experience in college was so transformative and really different than my everyday home life that frankly I never wanted to leave. So I kind of built my career around helping more students achieve that type of experience. And so I've worked in admissions at a few different universities. I was a college counselor at a high school. I worked for the Common Application. And now I founded this company along with my business partner about 5 years ago, and working with some phenomenal universities, including Winston-Salem State and Valdosta. That's my story, but let me kick it over to Joel to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Joel Lee. I'm Assistant Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management at Winston-Salem State University. I am originally from a tiny town in East Tennessee where the whole county went to one high school. But I've since lived and worked on 4 continents, and I ended up at WSSU, which is a historically black college and part of the UNC system. We started 127 years ago as a one-room schoolhouse with 1 teacher and 25 students as a university for recently freed slaves, and we are now 5,000 plus students, 1,000 plus employees here in the heart of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So I'll be speaking a bit to how we've kind of gotten here as we go along and what the need was for us to figure out how to get a signal through the noise, to refer to the title of the presentation. We were struggling with that, and I'll tell you a bit more as we go along about how we approached it, how we handled it with the help of some technology, and the impact that it's had on our campus and culture here at WSSU.
Thanks, Joel. And I will pass it over to Ryan for a quick introduction.
Yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Hogan. I'm the Director of Admissions at Valdosta State University. Valdosta State, we are the reigning Division II national champions in football. So we're thank you very much. I have to throw that in wherever I go. But we are a mid-sized university. We have about 11,000 students, and we are in Valdosta, Georgia. Valdosta, Georgia is about 15 miles from the Florida line. So natural palm trees growing around. It's a beautiful place to be. About myself, like many of you in higher education, I was a student at Valdosta State and took a job shortly after I graduated in the admissions office because they said they would pay for me to get my master's degree, and that sounded awesome. Drank the Kool-Aid that is higher education, and so I've worked here in the admissions office for 15 years. Really love, the work that we get to do, but I love working with companies like AdmitHub where we can change up the way we do things, and that's been kind of interesting, and we'll definitely kind of talk a little bit more about that later.
We should pass out the virtual higher ed Kool-Aid here throughout this webinar. So I love that, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us, and thanks for the introductions. And let me walk you a little bit through the agenda now. Basically, some of the areas that we're going to cover here today. First of all, we're going to talk about who is Generation Z, what are their characteristics, what do they like, what do they dislike, how do they consume information. Then we'll cover the theme of personalizing communication with a vast audience of students through artificial intelligence. We'll describe how conversational AI works in detail. Then we're going to look at two different case studies, Winston-Salem State University and Valdosta State, who both have deployed conversational AI into their enrollment process. And we'll also talk about how at least Valdosta is looking at using this technology with their current students on campus as well. And then we also want to leave some time for discussion and question and answers. Again, if you want to ask a question, feel free to do so at any time in the chat, and you can send it to us, the panelists. You can send it to all panelists and attendees. And I'd actually welcome really any discussion, and feel free to chat amongst yourselves as well, because we'd love to have this almost like a Facebook Live kind of environment where people are chatting and the thread is growing organically. So that's what we're going to cover. And first of all, we're going to talk about who is Generation Z, and I'm going to let Ryan take the show from here.
Sure. So this is Generation Z, and Generation Z accounts for about 25% of the U.S. population. And what's crazy to kind of think about, they've never lived in the world without the internet. Being born into this age of the internet means having the ability to engage in a global conversation with anyone and everyone at the touch of a button. With instant access to information, movies, and music through most devices, Generation Z has been groomed for an on-demand lifestyle. In short, Generation Z does not like to wait. I think all of us who work in different areas can agree with that. They do not like to wait. Information tailored to reach Generation Z, it must be customized, it must be conversational, must be mobile optimized, or you risk losing them. It also has to be personalized. These days, there's simply just too much noise in the college application and enrollment process. Email automation has created an enormous volume of spam. This, combined with the challenge of sifting through an overload of information on the internet, makes it hard for students to find answers. And we often find students are tuning out, even though they are desperately still needing help navigating the college roadmap.
And I'll jump in there as we go to the next slide. What you're seeing here is kind of a metric representation of what Ryan just described. So if you think back to 30 years ago, really colleges and people in general communicated really in two ways. They either picked up the phone or they sent a traditional letter. You fast forward to 2019, and there is such an omni-channel approach to communication that it can get overwhelming very quickly. You think about your average Gen Zer, they check their phone 150 times a day. I don't know how that compares to the people on the line. I'm not a Gen Zer, but I probably check my phone 100 times a day. So they're checking their phone for text messages and otherwise all day long, all the time. And that has changed the way that they engage communication. Text messages have become the norm for not just communicating with friends and family, but communicating with businesses, partners, all kinds of different aspects. And so you can see in the metrics there what kind of impact that's had on email. Your average Gen Zer, only 6% of your average Gen Zs report that they check email daily. Nationally and industry-wide, it's only a 20 to 30% open rate. So you can imagine, and you know from probably what you're doing at your own universities, the impact that can have on getting relevant messages out to students or helping them see the rationale for being on that email all the time. They also, as Ryan mentioned, they like instant gratification. And so, they're not really willing to wait that long on something before they move on to some other multitasking effort. So you've got to get their attention, keep their attention, tell them what you need to know very, very quickly, and then they're going to move on to something else. We can jump to the next slide, and what they're really looking for is a few things. Personalization, relationship building. You're going to see on the next slide what happens when you don't do those things as a higher education entity. Instant gratification. You think about Amazon. They want to be able to get on, get what they want. There's literally something called one-click checkout, and then they're on to the next thing. It's the same with the way they access a lot of things and what they now expect from companies, or in our case, from schools. They want it to be anytime, anywhere. They don't want the traditional 8 to 5 business hour answers. They're in high school during that time. So you often see that their communication happens at different times. And some of you may be experiencing that on your own campuses. What's really true for all of Gen Z is they've grown to expect a certain level of service and personalization in their customer experience. And that, of course, impacts pretty much everything we do from the enrollment management and admission side, or if it's not impacting what we do, it definitely should. Ryan, anything to add there?
No, I think you covered it.
All right, we'll jump on to the next slide then. Let's turn the focus off of the generalities about Gen Z, which many of you may have seen before, to what does it mean for why they disengage from us? So you can see some research here on the screen now. They don't disengage from us because they can't afford it in most cases. They don't disengage from us because we don't have the classes they need. Most of them disengage from us because they don't feel like we care about them, or they receive a poor service experience. You think about the number of emails or communications that you send out to your prospective or admitted students on a weekly basis. I'm betting you send them minimum 2 to 3 communications a week to one of those groups or the other. A lot of these students are applying to 8 or 10 schools. So you multiply that times 8 or 10 schools, they are getting a huge amount of communication, and as soon as they feel like that communication is not authentic or relevant, or that they've been treated poorly, they're moving on to someone who's going to do it better. So it really does still come down to that relationship. Technology has changed the way we do that relationship, but the relationship piece is still the most important. They need to feel like they're being supported in kind of a one-on-one way. Depending on who we've got on the phone, I'm betting, and on the webinar, I'm betting that if I asked why it's hard to deliver this one-on-one personalized support that they want at scale, we would get a lot of the same answers from all across the country. And I can see from the attendees list that we've got schools from all around the country, but I think we're all fighting the same battle, right? The student inquiries come in at all different times. They might email us at 6 in the morning. They might send us something at 9 o'clock at night. You're also managing peak volume periods. So you think about what your August looks like, what your July looks like, what your January looks like. It's very easy for staffs to get stretched thin, for phone hold times to skyrocket. And then when your staff gets overtaxed, or in my case, in a lot of the cases of schools all around the country, you may not have the budget to extend your staff overnight. Then you're into a quality and consistency issue where you are trying to keep up with volume while still trying to give that quality experience you're shooting for. So there's a lot of balls to keep in the air. And you can tell, again, from that pie chart you see, if we drop the ball, that student is likely to walk away or start engaging with one of our competitors.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to that too, Joel, is, we know any of you that manage admissions counselors, we had counselors that we would do our regular call nights. We come up here to the office, grab a couple of pizzas, make phone calls to students. And what my counselors would always come back and do is they're not answering the phone. You know, the students just don't answer the phones like they used to. So we were spending a lot of time and effort on those phone banks and just weren't getting any kind of return. And so, you know, by switching to this really sort of helped out manage that, and especially kind of with what you're talking about with what we know works. You know, texting and using some of that automation is how they almost prefer to communicate. So let's jump back in and look at this student right here. You can imagine the situation of a student like this. He's the first person in his family to go to college. He was recently accepted to his dream school, but when his financial aid process did not go as planned, he was worried and had lots of questions. Instead of waiting on hold, sometimes for hours, waiting for staff members to take a phone call, or even longer, up to a week, to receive an email response, is there a better way to ensure that the student gets timely, personalized attention when he needs it most? And like Joel kind of said, the solution is to hire a lot more staff to be able to talk with students like him, or use technology to supercharge staff efforts and provide the 24-hour personalized support to every student. We'll go to the next slide. Only in the last 2 years has technology been able to provide 24/7 personalized support to every student. Now, with the combination of the artificial intelligence and targeted human support, every student can get the help that they need when they need it. With this technology, we can combine behavioral science and artificial intelligence to support students on the path to and through college by individually guiding them through the complex tasks of and gathering data, conducting interactive surveys involving advisors, and responding to their questions 24/7.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about how the technology works. We're the tech partner that has worked with both Winston-Salem and Valdosta in this regard, and basically we're using conversational AI to help students navigate this path to college, but also when they get there to help them stay on track. And you know, when my friends ask me, well, really, what does that mean, Kirk? I say, well, it's kind of like Siri for college, but that's really only telling about half the story. Basically, we're putting a virtual advisor or virtual assistant in students' hands so that they can access 24/7 to get immediate responses to their questions about college. But we're also helping colleges to proactively reach out to these students to gather feedback and to walk them through processes from point A to point Z. And the way it works, I mean, this is basically what it looks like to a student. You know, it's basically a chat bot that operates primarily over text message, although it can be interacting with students really over any chat platform. It just so happens, as you saw in one of the earlier slides, that text messaging is really capturing the attention of students the best right now, as well as obviously some of their social platforms. But you know, basically for a student, they don't have to download an app. They don't have to go to a website to search for information. And basically, they're getting a text message one day that says something as simple as, you know, hey, Ryan, I'm your virtual assistant from Valdosta State University. I'm here to help you 24/7. You know, ping me if you have any questions. And then from that point on, students can start asking any question that they have about if they're in the application process. They can obviously get answers to all their questions about that process or about the college in general. And then as more and more students are engaging with the bot, it's constantly getting smarter every day. And then in the meantime, as students are asking questions, the colleges are starting to reach out to those students and really turning these processes into guided conversations over text message. So, you know, does the student need help completing the FAFSA? You know, it can help them do that. Do they need to register for an open house? The bot can help them do that. And aside from, you know, really reaching out and nudging students, it's also really a fantastic listening tool. It's a great way to gather feedback and information, perspective from students that then you as a college can use to then retarget your communication and really help out students who need the most help. The example here is checking in with a student after they're admitted just to see where they are with their decision process. You know, are they really excited? Are they going to come? Are they unsure? Are they not coming? And if they're unsure, then it's an opportunity to really find out more about their concerns. Is it financial aid? Is it living away from home? Is it something about the academic profile? Is it something else? And once you get that information, your staff is able to utilize that information in a very targeted way to help those students find the resources they need, and also connect them to the appropriate people on campus to get them that personalized support. And I think the last piece, which Joel and Ryan will attest to here as well, in terms of how they've used this technology, they've really infused a lot of personality into it as well. As fun as it is to walk through the FAFSA process, we want to make it, really engaging and a pleasant experience for students, so that they really want to keep coming back to interact with this chatbot, right? They're building a relationship with a virtual assistant, and they're used to this technology in their daily lives, and they actually play with it. It's really interesting to see how students will interact. They'll get the help that they need, but then they'll have this playful banter back and forth with their chatbot. And so they can get everything done that they need to get done, but they can also have fun doing it. And that's really what matters most, is, making sure that students are forming this very strong connection to the campus community. So I'm going to pass it back to Ryan to talk a little bit more about how it works in detail.
Yeah, so creating, what we call the Mascots Brain can, to me, when we first started talking about this, seemed overwhelming, and how can we teach this thing, everything we need to know? And naturally, while students are completing certain enrollment tasks, they have lots and lots and lots of questions. And each of us had a brain or knowledge base developed for our unique institutions. And we started with around 500 to 600 frequently asked questions and their responses. And what's interesting, I want to kind of pause and point out, when you talk about AI, you think about Siri, and whenever you ask Siri a question and she doesn't know, she just says, I don't know. And it kind of frustrates my wife. And my wife always says, Siri never knows anything. But what's really interesting about this, though, is the more students engage with it, the smarter the brain becomes. Because what happens is, if it gets asked a question that it doesn't know, it says, hey, let me redirect you to a human, and I'll come back with that response. And then the next time the bot gets that question, it'll know the answer. So again, the more students engage with it, the smarter the brains becomes. And with the AI, our bots' brains can also handle misspellings, slang, or many synonyms that tend to be asked around questions. A student might ask, what's the tuition, or how much does it cost? It's smart enough to kind of know about that. This is an example of a guided conversation that uses branching logic. A student is asked if they would like to park a car on their campus, and based on their response, they are provided with the appropriate resources. Of course, students being students, 9 times out of 10, they won't follow the exact path of completing a survey like this. Instead, they'll ask a host of their own questions, like, where can I park my car, or can I get a scholarship, or when is the next Beyonce concert on campus? That might just be my college specifically. But the bot needs to be able to effectively assess the student's question, answer it appropriately, and then put the student back into the flow of conversation so they actually can complete the task at hand. The conversations and campaigns range from the relatively simple, like this one, or to something a little bit more robust, like this. This is actually an example of FAFSA, and if we have any of our colleagues from the financial aid office, this probably looks very similar to you, because this is what it's like guiding a student through the FAFSA process. So, but the bot is, smart enough to be able to redirect and kind of do that. And what's kind of interesting too is that a lot of this technology is already built, and we just have to do some simple customizations for your school.
I'm going to actually, I'll jump in to add a point to your thoughts, Ryan. There was a question that came in from David around how this connects with student data systems and how the interactions are tracked. Or does it connect with a CRM like Salesforce? Basically, the system can and does connect with CRMs, with SISs. we usually will do it's what's known as a secure FTP integration, but if there is an API, there can be API integrations involved as well. So all of the interactions are tracked, and Joel and Ryan can speak a little to this as well about how they track conversations or monitor student conversations on the platform. Every conversation is tracked, and when the bot doesn't know an answer to a question, or if the student needs to talk to someone, that particular response or question is then escalated to a staff member on campus. The thought of integrating with the CRM is a great one in terms of further personalizing the communication and having that information be very targeted to that particular student. The only caveat is as you sort of get deeper into an integration, there's really the potential to have almost TMI coming back into your CRM. You can imagine sending thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of messages back and forth with students, because they will, as I mentioned before, not only get the help they need and ask questions, but they like to play around with the bot. And so having all this data come into your CRM might not be exactly what you want, but there is still the opportunity to connect and to pull certain data points and certain information back into the CRM with that integration. So back to you, Ryan.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. So, conversations, they do change behavior. And one of the things that's important to notice in the article, Small Nudges Can Improve How Students Apply to College by Dr. Lindsay Page. She discusses text messaging can be a cost-effective way to help students matriculate. And we've definitely seen that. And I know Joel will probably say the same. But she offers 3 actions based on the findings of her research. One is educators need to shift from thinking about whether students apply to college to concentrating on how students navigate the college search and the application process. The second thing is, beyond addressing the application process broadly, as educators, we must focus on understanding the large set of the procedural micro barriers that students face. Third thing is, strategies to cultivate the student's success should include proactive outreach, encouragement, and support. And those are things that we've effectively implemented with some of our strategies. And okay, Joel, go for it.
Yeah, so I said that I would talk a little bit about kind of how we got here and what we were trying to accomplish. So we have about a 65% Pell eligible group. And then we also have a lot of first gen students. And what we were seeing was that we weren't necessarily having trouble making our freshman class, but we were really pulling our hair out, getting that class prepared and engaged in all the steps it takes to truly be ready from an enrollment perspective. You guys know, on the phone and on the chat, know how many steps your enrollment process has. There are so many, right? Getting these students through, especially if they didn't have a lot of experience with higher ed, if they didn't have a really engaged support system, or again, if they were just kind of bombarded by enrollment process messages from 5, 6, 7 schools a week, via email, for example. So we were finding that they were wanting to come, but they were running into roadblocks along the enrollment path, and sometimes that would lead to them disengaging or disappearing. So we wanted to go away from our traditional email-centric communication tactics, and we wanted to start meeting students where they were. We wanted to start communicating with them the way they communicated with each other, so that it would feel personal, it would feel relevant, and it would be timely. If they read an email a week and a half after you send it, obviously the impact is greatly reduced. They may have read it, but they didn't read it when you wanted them to read it or when you needed them to read it, in some cases if there's pending deadlines, for example. We also really had a challenge with staff. We're a regional state institution. that often means that staffing is quite tight, and budgets are quite tight. And especially as we came into your big summer communication months, or in January, for example, we were getting almost an overwhelming number of phone calls or communications traffic that our staff just could not keep up with. They, like a lot of your staffs, they were trying to juggle process, trying to juggle emails coming in, trying to juggle phone calls coming in, trying to juggle lobby traffic. And so we needed a way to get students a self-help tool. We needed a way for them to be able to get these answers without waiting on the phone for 15 minutes to speak to a human. Because a lot of the questions, I'm sure it's the same at your universities, are simple questions, right? What is my enrollment status? How do I accept my financial aid award? How do I figure out my housing assignment? How do I waive or enroll in insurance for the school? What's the deal with parking? All these kinds of questions that we get over and over and over again in the summer months especially. So we wanted a different way to communicate so that our students would engage earlier, more often, and arrive to campus more prepared. So in our first full cycle of changing our communication strategy and implementing this weekly text-based, AI-based approach to communication, we saw some really interesting behavioral changes from our students. Our yield increased, our enrollment increased. Our enrollment last year was the largest since 2014. Our yield was the highest it's been in 10 or 11 years. But some of the other interesting things, and maybe the things we were most excited about, were some of the behavioral changes, the more granular behavioral changes. And you can see some of them here on the slide, and I'll speak to a couple others. But our August phone calls decreased by 36%, for example. Students started getting the information they needed in a different way when they needed it, and so they didn't have to call us as much. We also saw a 74% increase from our freshmen in making that first bill payment deadline, which you can imagine how different August was for our staff. With so many more freshmen paying their bill early and on time. We had a 37% increase in timely immunization compliance on completing it by kind of a July deadline that we had. Which students had struggled to meet in the past. Immunization compliance was not something that they were used to dealing with or thinking about. So that made August the smoothest we've ever seen it. It also made it where a lot of our students were what we call RAM ready. We're the Rams, in case you can't tell. Were what we call RAM ready well before they showed up to campus for move-in and new student orientation, and that really has started to change the culture. We've seen it bleed over as those students become sophomores this year. And then more so, we've also seen it as a lasting impact. To give you the most recent metrics from our freshman class, and these are obviously preliminary, but right now our confirmations of intent to enroll are up 13% year over year. Our housing applications are up 10%. Our immunization compliance is up 500% compared to same date last year, and our financial aid awarding is up 20%. So once again, our freshman class is so much more ready than they've ever been. It's June, and a lot of them are already largely ready to start college, which with a fair number of first-gen, low-income, or rural students is a pretty big deal from our perspective, and just makes our summer lives so much easier. So that's the main kind of thrust of what we've seen as the impact measurements and kind of the behavioral culture change for our student body. And I'll turn it over to Ryan to talk about what he's seen at Valdosta.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So similar to Joel, we're a regional institution with not endless budgets and staff and that sort of thing. So we had a declining enrollment, and so we were looking at really changing up the strategies. And we titled this presentation "Signal Through the Noise" because that was partly my idea, because I felt like I was always just screaming at the students to do this, do that, do this, and that they just were like, oh, I don't know. And so one of the first things that I did not want to replace is the human interaction our students had with our staff. I've got great staff who are really great at their job, and so when we first started talking with AdmitHub, I did not want that experience to be replaced, and that was one thing that was very clear on. And I was very surprised to that showed that students were okay chatting with a bot about some of those questions, and if there was something more complex, they were happy that they could be redirected to a student. And so we've seen increases. When we started with AdmitHub in 2017, the fall 2017 class was actually a 12% increase in our new students, which was one of the largest increases in my 15 years here. And we really believed that we were giving them that information of what they need to do at the time. I think in the enrollment management world, we're like, here's checklists, here's all these things you need to do, but we're really kind of focused on, at this point, what should the student be doing. We've also used it to help with recruitment events. So we're texting students about our open houses. We have receptions that go on, and if I discovered it last minute that the address that we put in did not get them there, I can send out a text to everybody, register for an event real quick, and say, hey, here are the actual directions, those sort of things. We can send out surveys instantly, and Joel mentioned this in his slide that they had a 40% response rate to emails, but it's almost 100% to text. So we can instantly get back and say, hey, what'd you think? And they get that text and they like that. We've recently also gone campus-wide with ours. So it used to be just us in admissions talking with our new students, and what the students told us when they got here is, y'all did a great job, getting me here, but once you got me here, it seems like the communication just stopped. So we've gone campus-wide with it and really still maintained it to our enrollment management area. So we're not blasting the students with every time there's a movie or something like that, but financial aid processes and things like that, for our campus-wide students. Advising is using it, and they're really liking it. Similar to Joel, we're seeing the same kind of impact. We're in the middle of orientation season right now, and it's interesting to see all the students who are coming to orientation have filled out their FAFSA. If they were selected for verification, we've been texting them and saying, hey, here's what you need to do to satisfy verification. They're coming to orientation and it's done. I mean, we're just really, really, really impressed with that. And so those are some of the things that we've seen, and that's going pretty well.
Ryan, it's a quick question for you, because you had said, it's interesting, you said, you're engaging prospective students, but also have this technology engaging students once they get to Valdosta, but you're still managing the communication sort of essentially through enrollment management. Is that correct?
That is, that's something that's really important to point out, Kirk, is, this is not a system that, you can just set up and walk away from. So, having a staff member responsible for it is highly, highly, highly needed, but we do control all that communication because we want to make sure it gets sent out effectively, but also managing all the different other things that we've got going through the system. And that helps, I think, from the Admit side hub too. They're not on our campus, they're not dealing with 5 different people, they're only dealing with 1. And I'll just kind of brag on the AdmitHub folks for a little bit. They have weekly meetings with that one staff member, and they come up with fun strategies on things that they want to do. There's just things that they can do. And what I appreciate about a company is they encourage creativity. So if we kind of have an idea of doing something fun, they're like, yeah, that'd be a lot of fun. Let's do that. And so this isn't the company that you kind of get you set up and then you never hear from them again.
Well, I appreciate that, Ryan. Thank you.
Well,
and I think that, it's really interesting when you're talking about having somebody on the campus who's sort of like the project manager to work with this technology and engage students is really important. And you all do a fantastic job, since you're sort of engaging students campus wide and also within the perspective process, of really focusing on, like, the reason you do it is because you're focusing on the student experience, right? So they're not getting lots of different forms of communication. Well, obviously they're getting different forms of communication, but not necessarily blasted with, communication from so many different offices that they're tuning out. It's really streamlining that process so that students are, they're getting the one piece of information they need at the right time, and they're able to, process that particular piece of information, ask questions about it, walk through a certain process, etc. So it's really interesting to me that you're in sort of utilizing a student first mentality of really bringing all this communication together under one sort of supervisory process, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to know too is that when you're contacting these students, it has to be clear what you're wanting them to do. The Ruffalo Noel Levitt's surveys and all the research says, when they're reading an email, or especially in our case when they're getting a text, why are you contacting me? What is it you want me to do? And so that's why we've been very clear on the message, like, you were selected for verification. You will not get financial aid until you go do this. Yeah. And so that's where, we've been very, very, very specific with our messaging.
Yeah, we're the same. Every message that goes out is data driven. So you're never going to get, for example, a generalized, have you completed your immunization compliance ? Message. You're only going to hear about immunizations if you haven't done it. Same with housing, same with aid, same with paying your bill. You're only ever going to get a message if it's personally relevant to you. And that has kept our opt-out rate minuscule. We have a 0.9% opt-out rate at last look, so literally less than 1%. So virtually no students ever opt out. And that's partly because they're never really getting what they would consider spam or inauthentic messaging. It's never really sent out for the general audience. It's only ever sent out for what the specific student is missing in their process.
Can Joel and Ryan, could you talk a little bit about just how your students really feel about engaging or building a relationship with a chatbot? Number one, just, how they feel in general about interacting with a bot instead of a person most of the time. And then two, just with the current state of artificial intelligence, generally speaking, it's not perfect, right? Like Ryan, you were talking about Siri. Even the best AI around is not a 100% automation rate, right? So how do your students, and I know that obviously when you're representing an institution and a university, you want to make sure students are getting the proper information at the right time, and any incorrect answer or is not necessarily ideal, right? But how do you feel your students are working with the technology, with the automation rates as they are with AI, and how they just feel about chatting with a bot?
Sure, I can jump in. It's been interesting to see. They treat it much more like a human than you might expect. I think sometimes at the beginning they think it is a human. We introduced Winston as their virtual assistant. I think they think he's literally an assistant that's out there in cyberspace typing them answers, because they will ask him funny questions. They will sort of have back and forth with him. They thank him a lot. One of our most popular responses is thank you or thanks, which is interesting. Sometimes they'll curse at him, at which point he has a funny response that tries to calm them down. But it's interesting how I think part of that is achieved because our bot has a very casual tone. It does not sound like official correspondence from the school, because we know that they're more likely to disengage with that. So it will use some slang, it will throw in some emojis, it'll throw in some GIFs, it'll throw in some double exclamation points at times. It's a little bit, we try to make it fun or almost silly at times. Now, we still want them to take the information seriously, but we want them to stay engaged. The last thing we want is for them to opt out or disengage because they feel like it's this official university communication thing that's nagging them. That's never the intention. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see how much they engage them like you would engage an actual human or staff member.
Yeah, and I'll kind of echo, I mean, same thing. It's how you speak to them using a lot of their vernacular. Some of the slang, the emojis, the gifs that Joel's talking about, all of that's highly needed. That's why it's also important to have someone running this who might speak like that. As I'm getting closer and closer to 40, my students tell me I'm not as hip and cool as I used to be. So, that's a big component of it. But as I said earlier in my part, I was very hesitant about this just because human interaction is something I think is a competitive advantage for Valdosta State, is that we're not so big that we can't speak to our students. So when we started talking about automating some of this communication, I was very, very, very leery on it. But one thing that surprised me that Kirk, you asked, is how they responded to it. Is students are used to talking to an AI bot. This is what they're used to. They're used to Google and Siri and those sort of things. And we see the same things that Joel sees. They'll say, "I love you" to Blaze, which Blaze is our bot. They do almost consider him a friend, which, like Joel said too, they'll cuss him out or, do some things. But it really surprised me of how well they took to it. But also when he couldn't answer something, they appreciated having that human interaction, which was important for me.
Gotcha. Let me answer a couple of questions that came up, and maybe Joel and Ryan, you can speak to this as well. There's one question about how the escalation process works, right? So when an actual person needs to be looped into the conversation, how does it work, and what that interaction is like. I'll just tell you sort of the logistically how it works, and then maybe Joel or Ryan can speak a little to how their team has interacted, with questions that may have been escalated. But basically, a university will sort of enlist either. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's the general admission office email address. Sometimes it's by department. Sometimes it's by counselor territory. But a student who has a question that needs to be answered and the bot doesn't get it correct, that message will get escalated to that staff member's email inbox. Just like we're meeting students where they are, which is primarily over text message. We also want to meet staff where they spend most of their time. And I know for me, being Ryan, I'm even older than you are, but I spend most of my day in my email inbox. And so the questions will get routed to that staff member's email inbox. That staff member would actually see the entire context of the conversation and be able to respond directly to the student from their email inbox. Now that response gets then texted back to the student via text message, and the conversation then can continue there. So a counselor might say, "Hey, Ryan, here's the answer to your question, but I'm also free to talk. What's a good time to chat?" or something like that. But Ryan or Joel, any kind of additional thoughts on how your team has handled some of those incoming questions?
Sure. I think it's a partnership with AdmitHub. AdmitHub handles, again, a fair amount of the questions for us. If they find the answer quickly, then they'll just put it in the background. And again, as we hit on earlier, as soon as they do that, the bot, quote unquote, learns, because now it's got a new answer that it didn't have before. If it does get escalated to us, it's set up to come into the proper department. So the different departments have different escalation tracks. So if it seems to be an admissions related question, it'll go to a specific inbox in the admissions department, and it comes into our Outlook. So it transfers it from text to email. The staff member simply replies to the email, hits send, and it goes back to the student as a text. The staff's been trained to not send 3-paragraph long responses for obvious reasons, which can be a little bit of a challenge. But so that's how the escalation works for us. We have escalation tracks for admissions, financial aid, registrar, and then there's kind of an other track that tends to include housing and other offices that may not get the same volume of questions, and we have a general communication staff that's the escalation point for those.
Great, thanks, Joel. And then there was another somewhat related question about can student responses be weighted differently that might pull in someone to have a conversation, right? So, students having a conversation in a particular way, or there certain things that they might say or that might trigger a response from a person in general. Now, I will say there are certain sensitive topics, we call them, that will automatically loop in a person. Basically questions around student health, for example. A student is feeling depressed, and so that would trigger a response directly from a person. And it's also interesting as the AI kind of learns the way students speak, because obviously they're not speaking the sort of in proper grammar in English all the time, but it learns every day in terms of sort of traditional slang and the way that Generation Z is speaking. It's learning of how certain situations can be particularly escalated to staff. So we can sort of help set up certain sensitive areas or triggers that might automatically loop in a staff member, or if the student just wants to talk to someone, other than the bot, even though they feel Winston is a real person. Maybe it's because Winston is really a formal name. Valdosta's bot is called Blaze. Now, I would love to have that name personally as a nickname, but that's, the students probably know that it's a bot. So hopefully that answers your question. But there was another question then about the use of the technology on other platforms, other chat platforms, other than text message. So there are certain universities that, aside from text messaging, are using the chatbot via Facebook Messenger, for example, and that can be, obviously it's mobile optimized for students, but that can also be on your website as a particular way for students to chat with the bot there. So we do have, there are ways to utilize the technology on other chat platforms. I did hear a rumor that Instagram will soon be allowing bot interactions on that platform, which is very, very exciting. Obviously, they are owned by Facebook. So when that happens, that will be, I'm sure, very popular in terms of university usage. The other particular platform that we would love to start engaging students with is WhatsApp and potentially WeChat for both for international students. It's a little tricky right now, sort of integrating with both of those, just in terms of the business logistics. But I know that both companies are working to make that a simpler process, and so once that happens, these chatbots will be engaging students on those platforms as well. I mean, the bottom line is that it's platform agnostic. It's really just a matter of where students are spending most of their time and integrating it there. And then sort of go ahead. Sorry.
I'll add one more quick point to kind of how we've built this to work. It's really got to be integrated into your overarching communication plan. So what we will tend to do is, if we want students to do something like accept their financial aid award or even complete their admissions application. I'll give you a recent example. We had a bunch of incomplete transfer applications, and we hadn't been able to get the traction we needed with them via email. So we did an interactive text campaign where it reached out and said, are you still interested in attending WSSU this fall? We got about a 50% response rate, which is pretty great. So literally about half of our incomplete transfers all came back within like a day and said yes, they were interested in still attending. Then the bot automatically asked a follow-up question that said, great, would you like a counselor to call you? And about 35 to 40% of the respondees responded, yes, they'd like a call. Then we hand that information off to admissions, and they do the call campaign. Sometimes we will also combine it with a social media post. And so what we're trying to do is hit the students on multi-channels so that if they miss it on one channel, they'll get it on another. But it's taken a while for us to figure out kind of where the bot begins and ends, if that makes sense. We've also got an app that connects to our our kind of academic advising. If you're familiar with Grades First or the EAB platform, we've got an app, we've got a bot, we've got a student portal, we've got social media, we've got email. So that's one thing you've also got to kind of clarify as you build this is, where does one communication platform sort of begin and end, and what are you really trying to accomplish with them? Otherwise, it kind of becomes the Wild West, but it works best for us when we send out a very targeted communication and then have the response to that communication lead to another form of communication on a different platform that's still tailored, if that makes sense. I hope I said that in a way that makes sense.
Great. There was another question around creating profiles or sending information to different groups of students. For example, getting them specific information based on their academic year or their major or their home state or other demographic information. That's absolutely possible to do that, to send certain messaging to certain groups of students based on a particular demographic or particular area. But Joel or Ryan, have you done any of that sort of targeted messaging to specific groups of students, or have you focused primarily more on engaging the entire group at once?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one, Joel. That's something that I really enjoy about the product, is that you can differentiate, who you're talking to. So, Joel and I've given examples on students that need to complete financial aid, but really there's anything you want to do. I mean, like I said, we use it for registration for our recruitment events. If it's, a group of students on campus who have not paid their bill, I mean, you can segment the audience however you like, and tailor the message. And, I think that's what we keep talking about is I don't think AdmitHub folks, Kirk, you wouldn't even advise to send a blanket message out, just because that's what gets you overlooked and looked at spam. So whenever someone's talking to you, you're saying I have not done something. So, that's kind of encouraged, I would say. Wouldn't you agree, Kirk?
Yes, absolutely. It's really sort of, you're thinking about capturing the student's attention, really not, the basic goal is to not, really not to frustrate them or annoy them to the point where they're opting out, right? And so with, both of you sort of having very high engagement rates and very, very low opt-out rates, I think that the sort of the overarching, theme around personalization with this generation of students and not having it be sort of felt as spam is very helpful in terms of making students are staying with the conversation.
Yeah, and I see a question just came in from Daniel about replacing the call campaign. My staff loved it when we did that. We used to come in 4 to 7 Monday through Thursday, make calls or whatever. And I'll be honest, for about 3 or 4 years, I made them do that. They hated me. They hated doing it. The students didn't really like it because they're getting phone calls from numbers they don't recognize. We're leaving voicemails. To be quite blunt, it was a complete waste of time. And so now we kind of have it set up into a tiered process. Once a student's accepted, I have a task set for my staff to be able to, one, they get an automatic text from AdmitHub saying, hey, congratulations on your acceptance. So no longer do they have to wait for something to come in the mail or, monitor a website. As soon as they're accepted, they get that text, which, they love. We dress it up, put fun pictures and all that sort of thing. And then there's also, our staff will do those follow-up actions, so if you haven't registered for orientation, they'll send a text and say, hey, my name's Ryan, I'm your admissions counselor. It doesn't look like you've registered for orientation. One thing that makes us different, though, and I realize, is we did purchase cell phones for our whole staff. So, instantly, their group of students have their cell phone numbers, and so they can chat with the bot or they can directly text with my staff. And my staff like it. I mean, it's just a better use of their time, but also that we're not doing the call center thing. And one of the last things I'll say, if you're just thinking about this, being in this industry 15 years, it feels like we're at that moment where cassettes turn to CDs or videotapes turn to DVDs. If you're not texting students yet, you're at that moment where if you don't do it soon, you're going to be kind of left behind. I know it takes budgets. Trust me, it took a lot of convincing on our side. But again, for somebody who's been in this industry 15 years, it feels like we're at that moment.
Great. And it looks like we are at the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of your time, and also thank you so much for joining us there. I know there were a couple questions in here amongst the group about cost and what this, how pricing works for institutions. And we're happy to chat with you offline about that. Basically, it varies based on the size of the institution and the number of students you're engaging. And also there was a question about this webinar being available to folks after the session. And what we will do is we will send everyone who is registered a link to the video, and feel free to share it as you wish. So Joel and Ryan, thank you both so much for your time and your perspective. You've been amazing thought partners to work with. We've had a blast working with your students and helping you engage students with this technology, and we appreciate the time that you spent with us today. And thanks to everyone who has joined as well, and best of luck with the rest of the summer. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.